What's the best turntable mat to improve the performance of your setup? There are so many different types of materials and approaches to turntable mats, so it can feel like a bit of a minefield in terms of what's out there. Today, we're going to look at some of the best turntable mats available out there. I'm going to go through some of my experiences that I've had directly with different turntable mats over the years, and then we're going to kind of basically just go over some of the pros and cons of each one. So that's today's topic. Let's get straight into the video. At first glance, changing the Turntable Platter Mat, it might not seem like it's going to make that much difference. If anything, it can seem like a simple aesthetic upgrade, but the reality is there is so much more to changing your turntable platter mat, the surface that your records are going to sit on, than just the way it looks on your deck. All materials have an impact on the final output and sound quality, and this can seem bizarre at first. I mean, after all, how can changing the material between your record and the platter surface really make that much difference to the final output? But when you're dealing with a physical format like vinyl, the reality is, particularly when it comes down to the mechanical element of the process, every single aspect of the system affects the sound in some way, even if it's just in a very, very small way. But everything that comes in contact with the record, everything that is part of the mechanism of how your records are played, will have some sort of impact on the final output. Platter mat materials are often overlooked by turntable manufacturers, and in many regards it's kind of almost an afterthought, particularly at the cheaper end of the market. If you've got yourself, say for example, a nice affordable level project deck, then more than likely it probably just shipped with a very, very thin felt material like this one here. So these basic felt mats, they get you started, they provide a nice soft surface for the record to go on, but there are many, many disadvantages to these thin materials. Now, number one, straight away, if there is any hint of static in the system whatsoever in terms of your record, then you will find that this will absolutely just cling to your record as you take it off, and that is really super annoying. It will accentuate the static charge as well because of the kind of material that it is, and on top of that, particularly if there is any static charge there, these will act like an absolute magnet for dust and hairs and all kinds of stuff in the atmosphere around it. And then of course you end up transferring that to your other records, which is an absolute pain. So for keeping your records clean, they're a nightmare for that as well. Finally, they're not very good at turntable platter isolation as well. So a good turntable platter mat should do, at some degree at least, absorb and control turntable resonance. We don't want that getting back into our system because of course that clouds the audio and reduces the fidelity. Now I think a felt mat is probably the worst scenario you could be given, and let's say you've got something like a Technics deck, for example, you might be slightly luckier. You might have something like a big thick rubber mat like this, and although this is a better starting point, from my personal perspective, I'm not particularly keen on these either. They tend to have these big rings on them here that are a bit of a magnet for dust and dirt, so they're quite difficult to keep clean. And just from a tonal perspective, I find they seem to kind of almost over-isolate the record, which of course is important, particularly with a Technics deck where you've got a metal platter, but just from a tonal perspective, they're a little too sort of warm and fuzzy for me. I think you can do better with other options that are on the market. And just from an aesthetic viewpoint as well, I just think they look a little bit ugly. So your mileage may vary, and of course with all of the examples that I'm going to give, it's important to remember that taste does vary wildly when it comes to hi-fi side of things. It's music, it's sound we're talking about, and a lot of that is to a degree subjective, so you need to use your own ears and apply your own personal taste to any of these further recommendations. Number one on the list is a Cork platter mat. Now if you've got a felt mat with your turntable, then I could recommend upgrading to one of these straight away because they are so much better at staying on the turntable. If there is any static charge available, they're much less likely to encourage static, and they do a much better job of isolating the record from resonance as well. They're a significant upgrade and they're very affordable. This was my first platter mat upgrade. And I don't actually own the original one that I had for my original project turntable anymore, because I actually donated that turntable along with that platter mat to my brother who wanted to get into collecting records. But what I do have is this really beautiful decorative platter mat that's Cork here as well. This is from a company called Full Force HiFi, and they make loads of very different splatter effect type Cork platter mats. They're very decorative, and from time to time I like to use this in my living room just because it looks really cool. They have a vintage aesthetic about them, and Cork as a platter mat as well does have unique sound characteristics. It's got quite a warm sound to it, and it is definitely a huge upgrade on felt, and I actually prefer it to thick rubber mats as well, so I can highly recommend it, and they don't cost a lot of money. One alternative to Cork is leather. So some people prefer leather over Cork because it tends to be better at not generating any static charge whatsoever. The dampening properties are perhaps not quite as strong as Cork is, and it has a different aesthetic, of course. Leather has a completely different look to Cork. You either like the look of the vintage look of Cork, or you prefer, I guess, the more kind of classy look of leather. A really good example of a nice leather mat is this one from Groove Washer, where they've teamed up with a company called Hide in the Sound, and these are nice artisan, high quality leather platter mats. So from a static viewpoint, they're probably better than Cork platter mats, but from a isolation perspective, personally I think Cork works a little bit better, and some of it is just going to come down to personal taste, as I say. So if you can, have a listen to a Cork platter mat, have a listen to a leather platter mat, and make your own mind up as to which one you think sounds better. But I guess if I was to summarise the sound differences from my experience, then generally it tends to be that a Cork platter mat will be perhaps a little bit more on the warmer side, a little bit more coloured, and then a leather platter mat a little bit more transparent. So whether you prefer one sound over the other will really come down to your own personal taste. Next on the list is an acrylic platter mat, like this option from Hudson HiFi here. Now, whether or not an acrylic platter mat is a good idea for you will come down to your turntable, because if you have a turntable that already has an acrylic platter, such as the Project X1 behind me, then there is absolutely no need to go buy yourself an additional acrylic platter mat. You can simply put the record on the platter and you're good to go. Now, acrylic as a material is an incredibly popular option from an audiophile perspective because it sounds so good. Now, the reason behind that, the theory is, and I'll try and keep this as simple as possible for the purpose of this video, the theory is the two materials are so incredibly similar, acrylic and PVC vinyl records. The material is so similar that you get a situation where we call it effectively coupled. It's almost like the two materials are kind of one and together, and the benefit of that in theory is that if you've got vibration coming from the stylus as it tracks the record groove, which it will of course, then that vibration is more easily able to dissipate away from the record down into the platter material itself, or the platter mat material in this instance, and away from your stylus and cartridge. So that doesn't end up, in theory, getting back into the cartridge and clouding your audio output. So you get a tighter, more focused sound. And a lot of people do report hearing much tighter lows and clearer highs with acrylic platters or platter mats. And that is a direct result of that more easily able to dissipate kind of vibration side of things. So they're very good from a turntable resonance viewpoint, and they're very good at kind of dissipating any additional resonance that's in the record there as well. So that's why they're so good. That's why they're so popular as a platter material, but also as a platter mat material that you could place on something like a metal turntable platter, say in the example of something like a Technics deck, or maybe you've got yourself a cheaper MDF platter mat material. Just be aware that any height that you add, you may need to compensate for, and this goes for any of the options that we're talking about here, you may need to contemplate, depending on the design of that platter mat, with the vertical tracking angle of your tone arm. You might need to raise that slightly, depending on how thick it is. So if you like the whole idea of coupling the record to the playing surface, in the way that you would do so with an acrylic platter mat or an acrylic platter, then another product you could consider is looking at the Acromat by Funkfirm, which takes the whole concept of this to another level. So in a similar way to acrylic, the two materials are very well matched, but in this case there's a bit of ingenuity added to the whole process. So the sandwich material that this is made from enables there to essentially be a complex array of micro tunnels and pockets inside the surface of this platter mat that makes diffusing the vibration even more effective. So that's what they claim. I have used this turntable platter mat before and they do sound very good, but there's a couple of caveats that you need to know. This is a 5mm platter mat, so you absolutely will need to adjust the VTA of your tone arm to accompany this platter mat. There is a 3mm version which you may need to do less adjustment for, depending on your turntable, of course, and look at your turntable manufacturer's guidelines in terms of what they recommend here. But if you go for the 5mm version, there's going to be quite a lot of adjustment that you're going to have to make here. And also, of course, because this is a more engineered kind of product, a more designed product, then there is a cost attached to that. So it is a little pricier than some of the other options that we've already mentioned. So here's one of our more interesting platter mats that I'll show you today. This is a product from a company called Soundeck, and it's called a sound damp steel platter mat, which, you know, on face value, when I say that, sounds like a really bad idea. After all, metal platters, for example, are infamous for resonance problems. But this, of course, is different. This is sound damped steel, which is made from a construction of steel and aluminium made and sandwiched with a polymer. And this enables the whole platter mat to more actively basically diffuse the vibration energy, and it turns it into very microscopic heat energy. So from a dampening viewpoint, it's incredibly good. It's also really, really strong. So you don't need to worry about this platter mat bending or warping or moving during the playing process. It's really robust, and it's probably one of my favourite platter mats for putting on top of my Technics deck. That's the platter mat of choice that I use on my Technics deck, which is currently in my living room. It does an absolutely superb job of actively just diffusing some of that vibration energy. I really like it, and it's just really strong and reliable. So from a sound perspective and a pros and cons side of things with the Soundeck, because I really do like it, but they all have pros and cons. The sound has really nice deep lows, very tight focused high frequencies, and a mid-range that just makes instrument separation that much easier to determine. All very nice minor kind of subtle improvements to the sound quality that I really like. The downside of it is that it's quite a slippy matte material, so you probably will find that it will benefit from having very, very thin double-sided tape underneath it to prevent any slippage, or by adding and coupling it with something like a record clamp or a record weight. So there's always pros and cons to all of these things, but from a sound perspective, from a anti-static viewpoint, and from a turntable isolation and resonance control perspective, it's a really good option. So the last platter mat on our list today is the Eclipse from Hexmat, and it's a relatively new player to the market and brings a different concept to the market at the same time. So whilst most platter mats, of course, as we've already gone through, focus very heavily on coupling the record to the surface as closely as possible and dampening and taming resonances using the materials involved, this turns the whole concept on its head and aims to reduce surface contact area to as little as possible. And it does this by the form factor that it is. You can see it's a reduced size. It's a hexagonal form factor that will comfortably take 12-inch records and 7-inch singles, of course, as well. But on top of that, there are lots of tiny little bubbles on the surface here, that raised little platform that are on the record surface, not the record surface, the platter surface here. Those go top and bottom, so underneath here, so it reduces the contact surface area down to as little as 1 to 2 millimeters squared. So that's very, very small. And what I hear from an audio perspective, and I'm using this currently on my Project X1 over here, which is already pretty good, has a, an acrylic platter mat, so the differences are subtle, but the noise floor appears to be lowered as a result of this. So I like it from that perspective. It's a really interesting perspective. And the other side of things that this is very strong on is the full torque transfer. So it's very grippy. It grips the platter surface very well, and it very gently also grips the record well. So what they're claiming that does is provides full torque transfer from the platter to the record itself. So that will manifest itself in reduced wow and flutter, better speed consistency. So it does sound very, very good, and I like the concept behind it. It's very good for reducing static and all those kind of things. It ticks a lot of the boxes that you'd want a platter mat to do, but it is on the pricier side of the market. It's the most expensive one in our list. There'll be a link in the description below to all of the mats that I've mentioned, so you can go check them out for yourself, including obviously the pricing as well, where you can go buy these online if you wanted to try them for yourself. But yeah, all the details will be in the description below. So that basically concludes today's video. Thank you ever so much for watching. As always, what is your experience with different turntable mats? Let us know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your recommendations that you can recommend out to the broader vinyl community as well. That just helps all of us enjoy the vinyl hobby more, get more out of this hobby. That's what it's all about over at this channel. So if you're new to this channel, please do consider subscribing. We'd love to have you on board. And if you do choose to join us, then absolutely brilliant. We'll see you in that next video. Until then, keep spinning.